The show Adolescence on Netflix came out about a week ago. It's making a lot of noise on the internet, a lot of political discussion. Is it feminist propaganda? Is it highlighting something very important? I think both, actually. And I would actually like to take it a little bit deeper than the superficial political discussion. Culture is downstream from nature. What do a population of people perceive about a certain subject? What are the subconscious, unconscious forces going on in the population, the same population, specifically male collective unconscious? What's going on here? Now, I realize I'm a little bit late to the party. The show's been out for a week, which means it's already probably old news. A week ago, when the show came out and there's a lot of buzz about it on Twitter, a friend of mine who listens to my podcast said, you need to watch this show and make commentary on it. That night, which was a week ago, I watched the trailer. I felt sick to my stomach and I immediately was like, I can't watch it tonight because it's going to keep me up. One, because I strongly empathized with the main character, the little boy. Spoilers are going to be in this analysis in case you didn't know. The little boy, the 13-year-old boy who kills a girl. Incel, that's one of the main themes. I felt a lot of identification with him. Reminded me a lot of being 13 to 15, where I went through very similar emotions that really stung, but also in this stage of my life, strongly empathizing with the father, because the father-son relationship and the passing down of masculinity from an unconscious psychological perspective was a big theme in the show, which is the main thing that I want to talk about. The boy and the father representing essentially the two things I'm going to talk about in this analysis. The first thing being the failure of the boy as the hero in his life, using a Joseph Campbell lens on things, his failure of status, what we in modern culture call inceldom, and all the feelings and behaviors that come with that. And the second thing, more related to the father, which is the Joseph Campbell term would be primary versus secondary fathers, which I'm going to explain. It's from Campbell, but it's very in alignment with Jungian psychology, and in fact, probably inspired by. So the first thing I want to get into is what the show did really well. And from a filmmaking perspective, it really is a masterpiece of a show. Screenwriting, acting, the single shot photography, a lot of people are talking about that. Really amazing. But also in the writing, in the meat of the show, in the psychological perspective shared. I'll actually say for any conspiracy theorists or the people who are hypercritical of the show, saying it's intentional feminist propaganda to put down men or to be anti-masculinity or to neuter boys even more for the next generation, which may or may not be true. I will say, if it is propaganda, again, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that it's not insidious. There was a genuine attempt to, say, reduce violence against women, which I'm sure we all can get behind. If it is propaganda, if it was meant as propaganda, it is effective. We're going to talk about this more later in this analysis, but it has to show an accurate map and then lead you to a conclusion of what you should do with it. And I actually think its map is 90% accurate. Ironically, it has a lot in common with what I think the antithesis of it is, which is the Red Pill Manosphere map of man-woman dynamics. It actually overlaps, I would say, what the show presents and what Red Pill presents and what I believe reality is. The Venn diagram is 90% overlapping. But then it leads to some things that are maybe only 10% of what the show portrays about male psychology, but unfortunately, and I'm going to assume unintentionally, leads you to an incorrect conclusion. And again, I think very unfortunately, and I'm saying this both as someone with a son who I want to raise to be a happy, healthy, fulfilled man, a daughter who of course doesn't want a world where there's violence against women, certainly where that's not normalized. Now, the big truth, and we could even call it the red pill truth in quotes, that the show hits on very accurately, and I think in a very empathic way towards men and boys, is what I guess Gen Alpha calls the 80-20 rule. Pareto distribution, which is simply that 80% of women are attracted to 20% of men. Actually, in reality, it's probably more skewed than that. I haven't looked at Tinder data in a while, but the last time I checked, I think it was more like 90% of women are attracted to 5% of men on Tinder. It doesn't actually have to add up to 100. Anyone who assumes so doesn't understand statistics. But the thing that they really portrayed in the show so masterfully is that if you are a low status male, regardless of what percentage of the population is considered bottom of the barrel, you're basically a non-person. You're a non-person in social hierarchy amongst boys. You're a non-person when it comes to women or girls, which is where a lot of the emotional content comes from, in a way that's more abstract and less in your face. You're a non-person in society. And what they really highlighted is that this young boy, who ironically he's not like, he keeps saying throughout the show, like, I'm so ugly, girls don't like me. He's basically sharing that him and his two friends are the lowest status boys in their high school. The boy who's cast as the killer, he's actually a good looking kid. He looks very innocent. He looks like, and actually this is one of the things that like pulled my heartstrings as a father, is like, he has the facial proportions, and not to get like so superficial, but he has the facial proportions of a baby or like a little boy, right? I actually think that the actor, who is an amazing actor, I think his name's Oliver Cooper, amazing actor, he's probably going to be a very handsome man in a few years. Of course, they had to cast someone who's fairly good looking and cute, because if they had cast an actual incel looking person as the incel character, no one would have any sympathy for them, which only emphasizes that people who we perceive to be underclass or not attractive or not worthy of respect, especially when you're a young person, a lot of it has to do with looks and dating market value, if you will, or attractiveness. Like, people really do treat them as non-persons. And actually there's a scene in the last episode where a guy, I think they're in their version, the Wainwright's UK version of Home Depot, I assume, a guy who actually looks like an incel, like he's a grown man, but he has like a tiny jaw. And anyway, not to get so superficial, I'm on your side, saying he's on the side of the killer and the father. I'm going to break that down, and the fallacious ideas there too. But if they had cast someone like that as the killer, the show just wouldn't have worked. No one would have any empathy for him. Anyways, this is to say, regardless of his actual looks or attractiveness, he's displaying how much pain it is to be considered a non-person by your social hierarchy. But this is one of the things that I really get riled up about, in how our society invalidates the experience of a boy or young man in the situation of, there is so much pain about it. And I think our society, and this is an element of the collective conscious that I think is just wrong, and I would like to help correct for anyone who ends up listening or watching to this, is that it's not about sex, right? It's really not about sex. And sex and power, we're going to talk about in a second, but it's actually not about the pleasure of being inside of a woman or whatever comes in this sexual interaction. That was something that even the therapist in episode 3 of Adolescence, like, keeps going back to. Oh, does it make you feel powerful to see naked women on your phone or whatever? It's not about sex. Yes, obviously when you're 13, you're driven by hormones to be attracted to girls, right? But it's not actually about that. It's about self-worth. If anything, the hormonal drive and the desire for the opposite sex makes women or girls the gatekeeper of a young man's self-worth. All of this stuff about being liked, about being a, quote, high status male versus an incel, it's about self-worth. Women are just the gatekeeper or the reflection or the ultimate, most objective reality check of where you are in the hierarchy. It's not about just the pleasure of sex, which obviously a young pubescent boy, of course, wants to some degree, but it's not about that. It brought me back to a lot of pains from my childhood. I think I was maybe 14 or something, where my group of guy friends, it was maybe 8 of us. One of us had lost his virginity already, and I think that kind of activated the rest of us. Oh, we're not boys anymore. We need to be into girls, and we need to get this validation. Like, the whole thing of losing your V card, so to speak. Again, it wasn't about the pleasure of sex. It was more that proof that girls liked you, which meant you were a valuable human being. And I just remember this. It was a very meaningful and painful experience for me. All my other friends, in a way that was male ego, whatever, for 14-year-old boys, we each made a list of the order in which we thought we were going to lose our virginities, which was basically a proxy of how valuable a human being, or how much worth do you have in the eyes of each other. And a lot of my friends put me as last. And that really hurt. It really hurt, as whether it was true or not or whatever. Objectively, I was very shy and anxious and super nervous around people, let alone girls. So I don't blame anyone, but it hurts so bad to get this kind of check of, oh, all of your male friends, who were really my friends, right? People who knew me, they were close to me. They all objectively could see I was the biggest loser, and to the point that they believed that women would validate this. And I want to switch gears for a second, because a lot of how our culture views this kind of behavior. Label a lot of things in this story I just shared as toxic, if you want. But even like the misogyny or frat boy locker room talk, a lot of the verbal, let's just call it misogyny. What it really is being driven by is a fear of women. It's boys becoming men and adopting a certain kind of speak that largely, whether you call it women hating or not, it is objectifying of women, because when you objectify a person or group of people that intimidate you, you take away the emotional content, right? When you're objectifying the concept of women or objectifying women collectively, that is almost like an antidote to being intimidated or fearful that they're not going to love you. It's like a protection mechanism against the fear of rejection or fear of women. When I was in college, I joined the rugby team. There was a hazing ritual. It wasn't like super terrible, although there was a lot of drinking and emotional stress and stuff. And it was like a bonding ritual. And one of the things that you had to do was memorize a secret song that the rugby team had passed on a year to their freshmen. And every rugby team in the United States, I believe, has something like this. And maybe every rugby team in the world. And I think a lot of people, and myself especially, joined the rugby team because I was seeking this male guidance, which I'm going to talk about in the second part of this analysis. Joseph Campbell will call it this kind of male guidance, where men who are older than you, who know how to be confident, successful men, validation and attraction from women being a subset of that, they're going to guide you along. And so anyway, part of the hazing ritual of the rugby team, and I wasn't supposed to share this, but whatever, it's been 20 years, is you memorize this very misogynistic song, like this, like it's all about objectifying women and sex and this, and you're declaring it's almost like casting a spell on yourself, which is not that even the rugby team guys were necessarily misogynist or anything. A lot of them were very nice guys who, for reasons I'm going to share later in this episode, had a great sense of honor and respect for women. But we memorized this objectifying song almost as a spell, from my psychological perspective, to inoculate us from the fear of women. Because if you can sing songs that just refer to women's body parts and in some way believe it, you are not afraid of their rejection. You are not so emotionally attached that you'd be heartbroken if they don't like you. And I think one of the great contributions of the show to the collective consciousness is that it shows how much pain a boy like this can be in. I remember when I was in high school and girls treated me like a non-person, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. Girls in my school, literally in high school, would pat me on the head sometimes, be like, oh, quiet Rue, he doesn't talk that much. I can't tell you how much pain that causes. Like, a lot of people just brushed it off of, oh yeah, whatever, girls don't like him, who cares? It's not about girls. It's about self-worth. And then anyone experiencing this is certainly in so much pain that I think culturally we have not recognized until, unfortunately, the incel era, where we have these violent atrocities that come from it. In episode 3 of Adolescence, the therapist is asking the boy, Jamie, about his sexual desires and how he feels about women. And she says something like, does seeing a naked woman make you feel powerful? And the whole concept of sexual abuse is not really about sex. It's about making the man feel powerful. Without even going to the pathology side of things, I do want to stress on the less pathological side, all of that comes from not wanting to feel inferior. And even that comes from wanting to feel loved deep down, right? All of this crass talk, locker room talk, is an attempt to stop feeling like a little boy around the feminine. And I went into this more in the Mother Complex episode where I analyzed the movie The Graduate. It's the same idea, right? Even the Oedipus complex is a subconscious attempt to be seen as a worthy, viable mate by the feminine rather than a little boy. So one of the things that really struck me about this is that, yeah, again, I felt a lot of these same incel kinds of feelings, even though when I was in high school, the word incel wasn't around, and thankfully social media wasn't around. I'm glad that there wasn't that much influence. I'm also sad that there wasn't more influence, because I could have used a lot of guidance at this time in my life. I remember what maybe is the origin story of how I ended up even as a men's coach. When I was 15, or when I was even pre-puberty, I had this one female friend. She was the only girl I for whatever reason, I felt comfortable talking to. Then puberty hits, and obviously I fall in love with her, right? Because that's what, of course, happens when you're 14. And I will say, in a way that's not what happened in the show, right? In the show, the girl cyberbullies the boy. He asks her out. She basically cyberbullies him. Somehow that escalates to him killing her. plot of the whole show. This young lady who I was in love with, she let me down really nicely. So nothing against her. But the thing that hurt so bad was even in her rejection, even in her attempt to be nice to me when she rejected me, it was that it wasn't even remotely an option for her to date me. I felt this huge, like, personal fable, romantic rush of, I'm going to ask her, it's going to be like in the Disney movies, and she'll see, oh yeah, I'm this kind of loserish guy, but she'll realize what a good guy I am. She let me down pretty easy. She was very nice to me. In fact, she avoided me all day. It was Valentine's Day. I had to be extra dramatic and ask her out on Valentine's Day. She did her best, I think, to avoid rejecting me hard, but simply the fact that in her response to me of asking her out, it was so obvious that I was not even anywhere remotely close to a viable person to date. In the high school dating realm, just like the kid in the Adolescence show, I was a non-person. I was not in the pool of anyone would ever even consider that way, which again is more about self-worth than girls liking you. The modern term we would use now, based on video game terminology, is NPC, non-player character. Similar to the boy in the show, my brain chemistry was probably not stable, partly due to the hormones of puberty, partly because I was depressed, partly because of what we now refer to as low status syndrome. Your hormones, your cortisol spikes, all sorts of bad things happen within your neuroendocrine system when you feel like a loser. Subjective. But the point was, subjectively, it was super painful. And there was actually a very beautiful scene in Adolescence that I think highlighted this in a very accurate way and human way, where in episode 3, all of episode 3 is a dialogue between the court-sanctioned psychologist and the boy killer. She's asking questions to open him up and make an assessment of his psychological state. At the end of it, she goes cold. She says, this is our last session. I have enough information to make my assessment and give it to the judge. And the boy, Jamie, says, do you like me as a person? And not, do you fancy me? Do you like me sexually? Do you just like me? Because it demonstrates that yet to him, in his worldview, nobody gives a crap if he exists. He recognizes that even this psychologist who he likes and he opened up to and he trusts, even she doesn't care about him. And you can see that is one of the more crushing moments. It just is confirmation of this thing that the Red Pill community or Manosphere, Andrew Tate, which we're going to talk about in a second, maybe has highlighted to him, is that if you are low status, no one gives a crap if you exist. Now, I do want to say also that when I was depressed and going through something like this in high school, 2004-ish, social media obviously didn't exist. I'm going to talk about what did exist as far as the secondary father. When I was a kid, unfortunately, school shooting in the United States became an epidemic. Tragic, but driven by the same kind of things. Like one of the articles I read about the Adolescence show is that if this show took place in the United States, it wouldn't have been a stabbing, it would have been a school shooting. A lot of these, and this is what made the incel term part of the collective consciousness, common term in our culture. A lot of these school shooters put out manifestos. I've read 2 of them. I think it was the Palo Alto shooter. I might be remembering this incorrectly, but he was basically sharing about the incel thing. This is what made people start talking about it. And it's hard to admit, but I could relate to so much of what he said other than externalizing his pain by hurting other people. I could see how vulnerable I was in so much pain as a 14, 15, 16-year-old. But for whatever reason, it never occurred to me, or it wasn't in me, that the way to deal with my pain was to hurt other people. Instead, it led me to attempt to kill myself. But what I chose violence against myself, other people, and I'm not justifying any sort of atrocity or anything, but this is the road that it takes you. And we can say this evolutionarily, is that, obviously it's a cold way to put it, but if your unconscious feels that your genes are not going to pass on, because no one gives a crap whether you live or die, no woman will mate with you, your genes are not going to pass on. Evolutionarily, it makes sense that something will turn on, some genetic expression of you will activate, of you'll do anything to fix the situation, which unfortunately means extreme behavior as shown in the show. And there's one thing that actually, I'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about Andrew Tate, but one thing that I thought was very inaccurate in the show is there's a scene in episode 2 where the son of the primary detective informs his father about red pill and ins and all of this stuff. And that the 80-20 thing of 80% of women are only into 20% of men, which is largely true. And then he says, red pill says you have to trick them. And I've never seen that. I'm only peripherally aware of what people call the black pill community, which from what I understand are guys who believe that they can never be in the top 20% or they never can be attractive. So they have this very angry outlook. And maybe this is actually where incel culture comes from. But red pill as a whole, which presents this idea of hierarchies and that sexual attraction and all of this stuff, status is based on these very primal aspects of the psyche. None of them, I've never seen a red pill authority that would condone violence against women or say that this is the solution to your pain. If anything, the very harsh messaging is that you'd have to do everything you can to be a top 20% male. You have to be more ruthless. You have to be physically strong, emotionally strong, make a lot of money, all of this stuff. Maybe there's like a whole other subsection of red pill that I'm just not aware of. That violent misogyny, so not like verbal, the coping of objectifying women when you're speaking in the locker room to mask your fear of women, but like actual violence, like physical violence, would be considered extremely weak by an alpha male society. It would be considered like the most beta thing you can do, because if you accept the red pill ideology that life is a battle, or a man's worth is not inherent to him, he has to fight to be in the top 20% to have any sort of value as a human being. That's the game you have to play. The only way to win is to make the top 20%. To then react in a violent way towards women or anything would be you considering yourself someone who can't win the game, a loser. This might be hard for women or very feminized people to understand, but it is an aspect of male emotional logic. It's the same idea of why rapists or anyone who has abused children will immediately get shanked in prison, at least in the United States, right? Because in a hyper alpha male society, such as prison inmates, even amongst guys who can remorselessly kill and steal and do all sorts of violent things, it is considered so dishonorable to pick on the weak. It's proof that you're a weak man that they have to kill you. So this is just to say that there's no way that the red pill manosphere in any way condones or normalizes violence against women. If anything, the reaction would be the opposite. And this reminds me of a quote from Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, who was on my podcast a long time ago, wrote a book that really deeply impacted my life on killing. He said something that's always stuck with me, that deep down every man craves a righteous battle. And some people can say this is a toxic aspect or a toxic correlation with testosterone, that men inherently want to fight when given the opportunity, which is why we like sports and financial trading and all sorts of stuff. Like there's a fight in it, or chess even. But we're looking for any sort of morally justified opportunity to do that, to express ourselves as men, to prove ourselves to ourselves as men. We want to show that we're the strongest, and violence against women is the opposite of that. At least that's my educated perspective of the manosphere. I do want to address one more thing about the propaganda angle. If this Adolescence show was meant as some sort of propaganda, who knows what the intentions were, but again, effective propaganda has to take you down a logical path. So it has to start with things that are accurate, and then maybe it has to show you something that's, oh yeah, I agree with that. And then maybe it shows you a newer fact of, oh, I didn't know that, but it makes sense with the first two things. And then it leads to a conclusion. So if it's insidious propaganda, it could be something that tells you a bunch of true things, maybe a new fact, and then this is why we need to do something else. So just as a hyperbolic example, 1930s Germany, Hitler shows up, points out some very true things that the German people could agree with. The economy sucks. Like we really got a terrible deal post World War I. Our people are emasculated. Communists have ruined this and that. And oh yeah, by the way, this is why we should kill the Jews. It was like, that's a bit of it. I'm oversimplifying, but this was like the path that the propaganda took the people on, where they could do something extreme or believe something extreme. So if this is the case with Adolescence, what they basically did is they displayed the truth. Nobody cares about low status males, which either is something that we can confirm if you're aware of this stuff, or maybe it's a new fact that you can now agree with because it's objectively true. The next thing was that men who feel this way are in so much pain that they're desperate for help or anything that would take them out of this. And then the third conclusion it takes you on is that red pill radicalizes boys to violence, or the manosphere radicalizes boys to violence, and therefore we need to annihilate red pill, manosphere, Tate, neuter the anger or the emotions of boys, because then we'll have safety. And it's those latter two things. One, the third thing, that red pill radicalizes boys, I think is inaccurate. Secondly, the implication that we have to neuter boys then, or eliminate masculinity, again, I think will only lead to its opposite, unfortunately. When you're in pain, obviously you look for solutions, right? This is like a basic truth in marketing. Advertisers try to pull at our pain so that we buy stuff, right? And for myself, again, when I was in high school, social media didn't exist. Almost all corners of the internet were dark corners, and I ended up on this email list of a guy who was basically a dating coach, internet marketer. This is before even the PUA, pickup artist community existed, at least in name. Eben Pagan, I have nothing against him or whatever. Like, he went by this name, David D'Angelo, but he taught dating advice in the early 2000s. And at 15, I didn't have a credit card, so I couldn't buy any of his programs, which his emails promoted. I would run home after school every day, check my email. In 2004, 2005, nobody received much email. I only had one email a day. It was from this guy. And his emails were trying to sell his dating program, learn how to be confident with women, whatever. But I would always run home and read his emails because they gave me hope. I couldn't afford even his ebook, right? I didn't have a credit card. I couldn't buy any of his stuff. But his emails gave me hope that I could learn how to not be a loser, that somehow I could learn how to find success. So I had some self-worth. It was obviously a map for my own self-esteem. And moving into this last half of my analysis, that is like the big gaping hole that this show leaves. Again, I don't think it's necessary. It was meant to insidiously try to neuter men, but I do think that it leaves this implication, or it leads the audience down this assumption that now we need to control boys even more. And I will say, so talking about Tate and stuff, I'm going to talk about him more and what that means in the male collective unconscious right now, why Andrew Tate is popular, why Red Pill isn't popular. But again, as I mentioned before, no one in Red Pill advocates tricking women. And if anything, what I think is often assumed to be misogynistic, especially without context, is this hyper focus on making money and getting laid, right? The most basic, superficial or materialistic desires, you can say. The thing though is, and we're going to talk about the map again, reference this, like the map that the show presents, that Red Pill presents, is that it's all about status. And when it comes to deeper sexual dynamics and social dynamics and ultimately self-esteem is the prerequisite. So if you listen to my podcast, my big general advice when it comes to relationships with women or dating is that you have to develop your sense of empathy, not for moral reasons. That's not to be a good, nice guy or anything, but because that allows you to connect and read signals and know when to be dominant versus not. But the thing is, all of that only matters with the prerequisite that women or people respect you, which is what Red Pill in some ways overemphasizes, but it is the starting point, which is why the Red Pill ideology is so attractive to young men. If they're living in the matrix and they think, if I'm just a good person and I follow the prescriptions of society, then I'll be loved, women will like me. And that's not true, right? You have to be worthy of respect. And then and only then does it matter if you're a kind person. There's an order, right? If you don't earn the respect of people, if you don't earn the respect of women, if women don't see you as a viable person, then it doesn't actually matter whether you're nice or not, right? That only matters later, right? It only matters afterwards when you've proven that you're viable. Oh, you're also a good person. You're also not going to take advantage or be cruel or anything like that. Great. You're the full package. But if you don't have the first part, no one cares whether you're nice or not. Okay. So going to the second piece, the secondary father. Secondary father is a term coined by Joseph Campbell. That's part of the hero's journey monomyth concept. The secondary father is synonymous with the mentor in the hero's journey. And I say this all the time. The hero's journey was modeled after male psychology. The hero's journey are the steps of a male psychodrama, because that is what has been the internal psychological template for boys being successful men. The fact that it has overcome the film and storytelling industry and everything is hero's journey, every marketing sequence is based on the hero's journey, I think is a huge insult to women. This is a whole other thing, and I'm going to do another episode on this. I'm actually going to bring my wife on to talk about the evolution of Disney princesses. As the father of a daughter, it actually makes me very upset that the new model offered to girls is, hey, act like a boy psychologically. The whole secondary father idea is that for the boy hero in the monomyth, for a boy's psychology for him to grow up into, or to step into being a hero in his life, feeling like he's empowered, feeling like the hero archetype being the idealized form of a young man. Let's say before he has children, he goes off on the adventure, he kills the dragon, he throws the ring into Mordor or whatever, right? He comes back a hero. And the implication psychologically is then he settles down and has kids. The hero's journey is specifically male adolescence in different forms, obviously, as Joseph Campbell pointed out. The primary father, who in a biological sense would be your actual dad or whoever was the primary male role model who raised you, in the hero's journey context, in the monomyth context, represents the status quo. This is where he came from, right? The hero has the same job as his father or his male role model, right? Luke Skywalker's case, it was his uncle, right? He's destined to be a farmer just like his uncle. And his uncle is killed and he has to seek out a secondary father in Obi-Wan. Now, the psychological function of the secondary father is that he is the person, he is the male role model that a boy seeks to fill in the gaps of his upbringing, right? Luke Skywalker got a hard work ethic from his uncle. His uncle dies, but he doesn't learn the skills to channel the force or actually be a hero. He gets that from Obi-Wan. So your secondary father, in real terms, is a chosen mentor that is a necessary stage in male development. Arguably, and I think Joseph Campbell would argue this, and I would agree, is that a boy can't feel like he's stepping into herodom until he creates some separation from his upbringing. Even if his dad was an awesome dude who did everything perfectly, and we're going to talk about this more in the show because the dad in the show actually seems like a great dad. A boy can't complete himself as a man until he goes and finds his own way in some form. I know a bunch of guys who have true all across the board alpha male dads. Like their dad maybe was famous because they did something really amazing and took care of their community and their family and were kind and empathetic and bold and courageous. And you would think such a boy would grow up to be an equally awesome man. But I've seen a lot of these guys grow up to be and children who they can never get out of their father's shadow. They can never feel like a full man. And I would argue from a psychological lens is that they never left their father's shadow and sought their secondary father to complete themselves. So for myself, this is tied into this period of my life where I was suicidal for reasons that we've discussed. I sought secondary father energy, this email list of dating advice that I sought out, and later stuff that would eventually become PUA, which has its own negatives and psychological traps in it. But one person that was in my life, in real life, was my boxing trainer. My primary father, my dad, really great guy. I think I inherited a lot of very positive traits from him. My intellect, my way of speaking, my way of thinking, a lot of things that I use in my career now. But he didn't give me the things that were causing me pain, which was I didn't have confidence. I didn't know how to talk to people. I was very inhibited. So I sought semi-consciously a total opposite person, right? I sought a guy who was very out there, not so much an intellectual, more of a jock. He taught me boxing, which was something that built a lot of self-esteem. This is one thing that I give so much psychological credit to in the show, Adolescence, is that in episode 2, there's a few mentions of, because the two detectives go to the high school and are trying to understand the motive of the killer. And they see that high school is pretty miserable for most kids and for many reasons. And it's soulless, and it's no wonder kids are messed up these days. There's 2 moments in the episode where a character says what a kid needs at this age is to find something that makes them feel good about themselves. And I think that's a very deep truth. And I think that's something that every parent, my son also, in terms of masculinity, is like they have to find something they're good at, right? It could be in school, it could be out of school, it could be sports. We're going to talk about father's approval in a moment. That's something that, for me, that happened to be combat sports, right? It was the first thing in my entire life that I was better than other boys at for whatever reason, right? I played street basketball as a kid and I was on a little league team. I wasn't particularly good. I was a small kid. I wasn't good at anything, whatever determined social hierarchy amongst little boys, until I started boxing. A lot of my friends would come to the boxing gym after they heard Ruwan's boxing. I could box, and very often I would kick their ass, which is not to say whatever egotistical things, but it was the first thing in my entire life where I felt I was objectively better and therefore not a total loser, which was a really important thing. Like boxing, and I would say wrestling too, was the first time I felt like won at anything that other people couldn't win at or weren't as good at. And that, I would say, is the main thing that turned me away from suicidal ideation. Anyways, little lesson here, but I want to go back to the father here, because a lot of what's so heartbreaking about the show is that the father, Eddie, is a really well-meaning dad. If they showed that the boy killer came from a broken family or an absentee father or a father who beat him or something, then we as the audience would be like, oh yeah, he became a messed up, violent misogynist because he didn't have a good male role model, or he was beaten or abused or whatever. But they portrayed that the family was really kind. There seemed to be a lot of love in their family, mother, sister, son, and father. The father really meant well. The backstory is delivered throughout the series of the father really tried to make his son not a loser. He tried to get him into sports, but he didn't like football. He tried to get him into boxing. That didn't work. And there's these really heartbreaking moments where the boy shares about seeing his father feel ashamed at how bad he was at soccer. I don't know of like why that is so heartbreaking. I think very few things may be more heartbreaking to a boy to see that, not that his father is even mean to him, that his father is so sad. And this is actually a thing that in the episode 3 with the therapist that was so beautifully done, is that the boy says all of these really self-deprecating things about himself, and the therapist just nods. And the boy is, oh, wait, aren't you supposed to say I'm not a loser? Aren't you supposed to say that my father wasn't ashamed? But the therapist says, it doesn't matter what I think, right? The truth is you feel that way. And you could see that the boy in that scene was wrestling with what Red Pill would call blue pill versus red pill ideology, of like the blue pill ideology of innocence, of if you just are a good person, the world will be good to you. Whereas the red ideology is that's not true. And you could see the boy is wrestling between these two things of, wait, aren't you supposed to tell me that everything's going to be okay? Aren't you supposed to tell me that my father doesn't think I'm a loser? But then he gets a hard reality check, and you could see that he's in this vulnerable ideological state where he's wrestling between these two things because he still wants the first thing to be true. And you could even argue in some maybe indirect way what drove him to violence against the girl who rejected him and cyberbullied him and whatever. What drove him to that was almost like this very inaccurate clinging to the Disney blue pill version must still be true. And the shock of that is what drove him to extreme emotions and actions. Now, I said all this stuff about the nice family, and obviously it must have been a conscious creative decision. A lot of a boy's self-esteem and masculinity is based on external accomplishment, right? It's nice to feel that your mother loves you from just being who you are. And actually, this is a important theme in my upcoming book, Taming the Anima, on the image of the mother. That's what she gives you, intrinsic self-worth. I'm a good person no matter what. Whereas the father image or father's approval is based on external circumstances, right? The father's approval, not necessarily his love. Father loved him no matter what. I think most fathers will love their children no matter what. But the father's approval, which is displayed by the pain of the shame of the boy being terrible at soccer, father's approval is conditional. It's conditional on actions, conditional on results. And on the one hand, that is just part of the truth, right? Your daddy loving you while you're a loser in every way doesn't get you any sort of worth from the external world. Dad being almost like an early childhood proxy for how the world's going to feel about you later. Now, obviously, if someone's dad's an asshole who disapproves or controls or constrains a boy in a way that's not accurate to reality, that's unfortunate. But from a psychological perspective, it seems very clear that one of the functions a parent has on the child is that you're giving them their early modeling of how reality is going to be. So on one extreme, a kid whose parents give them no boundaries and let them do whatever they want and be nasty is going to have a really hard time as an adult where they find out that, oh, the world doesn't put up with my tantrums, selfish behavior. Whereas on the other extreme, parents who hyper control their kids will likely lead to kids who have a hard time maybe expressing themselves because they assume that the world's not going to allow them to be themselves, which is not actually true either. The thing though with the father again is that a father that cared so much for his son, and actually there was a part in the end of the show where it was like, yeah, maybe I was just working too much and I wasn't around and I wasn't able to be around for his feelings. So of course he goes on his computer till 1 a.m. and looks up all these like radicalizing ideas. It was still hard for me to believe that such a self-aware and well-intentioned father would be so disconnected from his son. I don't know. I don't have teenage kids, so maybe I'll have to change my opinion on that later. But the big thing here, though, is that his father couldn't contain his shame. And that, again, just like the therapist not being nice to the boy, that hurt the girl who rejected me, my first huge crush who rejected me, was actually being nice about it. But the truth was she didn't care who I was really. While even being nice, almost hurt more. If she had been really mean to me, it would have been like, I could mask my feelings of pain with the fact that she was mean to me. But that she was nice to me and still just thinks I'm a not worthy human being hurt even more. And there was a thing in the show where they talked about anger, because the last episode of the show is basically the parents processing that their son killed someone and what did they do wrong. And they're going through all of that stuff. There was one thing about how the father, who was a really good guy, maybe passed on his bad temper to his son. I think that's a very possible and likely thing that can just happen, right? Your father demonstrates his upset at the world with anger. Maybe that influences a young boy to be like, if I'm really upset, I could hurt someone. That's okay. That's an okay way to express it. But there's also a bit in there where the father, he's crying, if my father beat me and I turned out like me, I swore that I would never beat my kids and I created a murderer. And here's where I think some propagandizing might apply, in that there's almost an implication that it doesn't matter what the parents do. Male anger needs to be neutralized. It is always toxic, which, going back to my earlier, maybe provocative statement, I think unfortunately this show might do the opposite of what it hopes to do, of reducing violence. It just doesn't fit. It just, like, that part of the map is not accurate, because what you have here, and this is finally going to why I think people like Andrew Tate have become so popular, is that just like everything we've been talking about in this analysis, it validates reality. Status is important. Your pain is real. You need to do something about it. But then, unlike what the show does, or what our culture does, or a lot of the, let's say, politically driven or feminist inspired messages to men, it doesn't give you something actionable to do. It maybe says something that is inactionable, or actions that are just inaccurate, just don't fit with human nature, such as be a nice guy, to just use a simplification. Someone like Andrew Tate, I would also say Jordan Peterson, I'd even throw Joe Rogan in there as like maybe 3 masculine role models in modern collective consciousness in descending order of controversiality. Obviously, Tate is the most extreme. Jordan Peterson, a lot of people think, is controversial, and Joe Rogan is fairly close to center, let's say. But they're all saying something like, you got to be strong. You got to do hard things. You got to face your demons. Tate makes it very simple. Get physically strong, learn how to fight, make money, and sleep with a lot of women. Whether you think that's the right message to a young boy or not, it is very clear and actionable. And when it's been preloaded with a map of, hey, you feel so terrible because it's all about status and hierarchy. You feel, I recognize, I understand your pain. Here's what you do. That's another form of propaganda, right? It's 2 truths, and I don't want to say a lie, but 2 truths and an opinion, right? This is what makes Andrew Tate so popular and so addicting to someone who feels lost and hurt. And to demonize all of that and be like, oh, it's all shit. I don't like a lot of the things Andrew Tate says. I wouldn't want my son growing up listening to Andrew Tate. In fact, I would almost say it as a failing as his primary role model or father, not just because I talk about masculinity, but just like I think any father. If your son needs to follow Andrew Tate, it means that you left too many gaps in his masculinity. The fact that Andrew Tate is so popular and these messages are so attractive to boys is a sign that there's a gaping wound in the male collective conscious that has not been filled, and I think, if anything, has been exacerbated by things like feminism. This idea that your natural male instincts, which does include anger and violence, they're just bad, as opposed to what I think is a healthier message, from I'm going to get to in a moment, of you have these things. You evolve to have these archetypal expressions, this desire for competition and status and lust and dominance and winning and all of these things. Here's a healthy expression of that. Here's how to use it to make money and provide for your family. Here's how to take on a cause that you believe in. Here's how to build something important, rather than what ends up happening with the incels and the school shooters and the boy in this show, or even the huge rise of men who choose to commit suicide, is that they're not given directions. Maybe they're not even given a map. We have the Andrew Tate who says something very obvious, and I think from a male collective consciousness perspective, we can see that in other times in history, Andrew Tate's message would not be popular because the male collective unconscious was in a different state. If you imagine Andrew Tate going to ancient Sparta and saying the same things he says, the Spartans would have just shrug at him. What do you mean we need to do all these? You're just saying some obvious stuff. In a society where masculinity is so highly respected and integrated, Andrew Tate would be obsolete. It wouldn't make any sense. No one would care about what he has to say. It would be a kind of a silly thing. And you can see, I mentioned Tate, Jordan Peterson, and Joe Rogan, but even he takes like someone like David Goggins, who I've mentioned in a few recent episodes. The fact that David Goggins is so popular with his message of stay hard, take souls, whatever the thing is, it's only relevant. And I like David Goggins, by the way, but he's only relevant in a society where that is a new-ish idea. In a society where so many men and people are soft, the constant message, stay hard, means a lot. Again, if David Goggins went back to the ancient Spartans and he's like, stay hard, take souls, they'd be like, what are you talking about, David? That's what we literally do every day. Anyways. So all of these figures that become popular, and let's focus on Andrew Tate because he's the most hyperbolic, popular representation of Red Pill and Manosphere and these things that maybe are off-putting to some or to many. They present reality very clearly packaged way that a young boy can be like, okay, that's accurate, right? You have to fight to be in that top 20%. Otherwise you're worthless in the eyes of women, which again, is not really about women. It's not really about sex. It's that women are a reflection of self-worth. And you could even draw this down to a genetic level of your genes are not going to pass on if women don't like you. Therefore, do anything you can to allow that to happen from your genes perspective. And again, I want to say this because it has to be harped on. This false implication is that there is no way that the majority manosphere or red pill would say that violence against women is the solution, right? That is not the direction that the map offers. The map being you have to be in the top 20%. The directions in general, whether it's Andrew Tate's hyperbolic materialist way of saying make money, get muscles, sleep with a lot of women, or Jordan Peterson's a little bit more logos driven idea of slay your inner demons, or Joe Rogan's kind of basic, straightforward, blue collar approach to it. If you just got to do hard things because hard times make strong men, or that whole thing, that whole cycle. These people become very attractive figures in masculinity because they give you a map and directions. Nobody of these popular characters or figures, I should say, that violence against women is the solution because they're presenting a game like, here's how to win the game. Violence against women would be, I think I can't win the game, so I'm going to ruin the game for everyone else, essentially, from a psychological perspective. And what I will say, though, because obviously misogyny exists in the world, obviously violence against women exists in the world, and even in these groups that I'm saying, obviously misogyny exists, and there's guys who maybe would harm women if they weren't held in check by the sense of other men. I believe it goes into this realm of misogyny. It goes beyond men. The harsh truth of men, you have to be tough, you have to be strong, you have to do things to be worthy of whatever from this fatherly psychological perspective. It goes too far into misogyny when the pain is so great, when the culture invalidates the experience so greatly that going hard continues past the signal, the internal signal to stop. And I would say addiction, substance abuse is a great, or substance addiction, I should say, is a great analogy to this, right? Obviously, we all have to eat food. Piece of cake because it makes my mouth feel good. But then after one slice of cake, I feel sick. Like I can't eat any more sugar. Like they're sucrose, blood sugar, whatever mechanisms that we all evolved to have. Oh no, this is too much sugar. It's going to give me diabetes. I don't want any more. Whereas a food addict may be largely driven by pain or some sort of trauma or some sort of other issue. Their governor for I've had too much sugar doesn't stop. The governor for, okay, 1 drink or 2 drinks feels pretty good, but 10 drinks makes me feel shitty. They don't have that. So they keep consuming the thing over and over. When the accurate advice to young men that you have to strive for the top of the hierarchy, that's how it is, goes too far into misogyny or antisocial behavior or any of these atrocities, it's when the recognition that, okay, I've been hard enough, that governor gets disabled. Whether it's through pain or trauma, there's probably a lot of psychological perspectives on this. But I would say, and this is maybe my anti-propaganda on this, is that when you invalidate the feelings of young men, when they're because there's the implication in the propaganda logic of the show, this implication of, okay, boys are in pain, they're being radicalized by this, they're being fueled to anger, so you have to like make sure they don't get exposed to anything radicalizing, and their anger will probably subside. Or maybe you neuter their anger and it'll just go away. They're in. Lonely 13-year-old boy who feels like shit. Just a phase he's in. He'll grow up. They don't actually grow up. No, they don't, you don't grow out of this. When you feel like shit, when you feel the pains and I would say even neurological damage of being a low status male who people think of as an NPC, that doesn't go away. Maybe such a person grows up and learns how to mask it and whatever the thing is. The only way he actually moves out of that pain is he learns how to be actually confident, which again is not about women. It's not about sex, but a man who learns how to be genuinely attractive, not meaning like he's not tricking women into bed or anything. He learns how to be genuinely attractive. That will give him a boost of confidence that he cannot get anywhere else. That is the only real sustainable solution to that kind of NPC pain as demonstrated by the boy in the show. When you invalidate that and think it's just a phase, they'll grow out of it, making someone in that kind of pain be like, oh, the world doesn't understand me. So when he gets to the point of, okay, maybe I'm being a little bit too hard, that feeling gets disabled because no, the culture, I need to push back against this evil culture that's saying that whatever I feel is incorrect. That is not the way to make boys and men more kind, more grounded, more secure, because ultimately all of this we can say from a less hierarchical perspective is about emotional security. Like just being a great meditator doesn't necessarily make you attractive and all of the feelings associated with that. But again, and I want to go back to this and then we're going to end this here with what my conclusion was after all of this. Again, with that scene with the therapist where the boy is wrestling between the blue pill ideology, the Disney movie ideology that he really wants to be true because life would be so much easier if it was just true, if he could just be a nice boy and do his schoolwork and he'd be a worthy person. He really wants that to be true. But even the therapist confirms to him that it's not. Anyways, so there has to be a conclusion. And again, I'm not accusing the writers of the show, who I think are brilliant in many ways, just for being able to create a show like this. I'm not saying that I think they have an insidious feminist anti-masculinity plot. I do think, if anything, maybe it was based on not really understanding some of these things and just thinking, okay, we need to show society that boys are being radicalized. And then maybe they just meant to leave it open-ended of, okay, parents will come to their own conclusions that they need to monitor what kids watch on social media. I do think that's true. A lot of the conspiracy theorists right now are saying, especially because of the reaction in the UK Parliament, that this might lead to some sort of laws passing that somehow control boys even more, or the government's going to monitor kids even more, which of course is a terrible loss of freedom. No, it's the parents who should be monitoring their kids, and any man, any father, head of household, it's your role as determined by nature, in my opinion at least, but I have lots of evidence. That is your role as the man who doesn't give birth, who is physically stronger, who has more of a whatever, to guide your family's ideology, hopefully into one that will lead to the most fulfillment and happiness and joy in your children. The conclusion I would offer to young people, young men, is the fact that Red Pill in the show, and everybody seems to agree on now, is that you do need to be in the top, right? Is it 20% or what? I don't know. But you do need to strive for a certain excellence, because if girls are reflecting to you that you're an NPC, it's not something to get butthurt about. It's to recognize, oh, something needs to change. And actually, if you are 15 and you happen to be watching this, or somehow you get this message, it's like, that is the best time to get that message and realize you have to change, because if you realize this in your 30s, obviously you can do the work and change your life. A lot of men I coach take that journey, but it is much harder than recognizing that I can change because your brain is so plastic when you're young. Do this. And I would say, actually, on the father side of things, and I would say for any man who has kids or will have kids, or basically you're past puberty and your masculinity is not just about yourself, but the people that you may affect, future children, wife, girlfriends, whatever. The best thing that you can do is essentially strive to be that 20% man, if not for yourself, but for your kids. And this actually gets me a little emotional thinking about it, because obviously I thought of myself as the kid, but I also thought of myself as the father. What if my son was going through this? As the primary role model, I would hope to provide my son with the model, not necessarily in how I treat and talk to him, although that's of course important, but on who I became, such that he inherits traits from me, that he doesn't have the insecurities of, say, the 80% male, of the low status male, which would hopefully mean that he doesn't have major confidence issues as a teenager or whatever, so that when the time came for him to leave the nest and seek his secondary father to fill in whatever gaps that I couldn't possibly fill in for him because I'm not ever going to be a perfect human, I could at least set him up with enough of a basis that when he goes to seek the secondary father, it's not based in insecurities. It's not based in pain that he needs to seek an Andrew Tate or whomever. Jordan Peterson is the daddy to a lot of lost boys. Anyways, that was the conclusion I took from it, that you have to strive to be an alpha male. Because if not, there's the greater likelihood that your son will end up on a bad road, which in the extreme, as in the show, maybe he does something really terrible. But even in not, there are probably tens, hundreds of thousands of young men in the world who would never harm a woman, who would never shoot up a school, who would never hurt anybody, but they're feeling the same amount of pain. And maybe that means they choose to harm themselves. Maybe they numb themselves out and lead a life of quiet desperation. It's the same exact thing, which is male pain. And truthfully, there is only one way out, which is to strive to be the best, most powerful, in quotes, alpha guy possible. Because not to say that guys who are high status don't have issues or don't have problems. Of course they do. But this specific issue, this kind of pain exemplified by the incel, by being an NPC, by getting the reality check from the world that you are a worthless human being, which sounds harsh, but that is the reality of the experience of such a boy. The only way out is to strive for the top. I did choose to live stream this on a whim. I don't know if it actually worked or not. So if you happen to be commenting on YouTube or Facebook and you didn't see me respond, it's just because I can't see it on the screen. Anyways, that's my analysis of the show Adolescence. And I hope that it gets people to have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of male psychology and what's going on specifically right now in the male unconscious. If you disagree with anything I said, feel free to argue with me in the comments or DM me on Instagram. But I felt very strongly about this and I actually feel quite a bit emotional. If you haven't watched the show, I just did spoil a lot of it for you, but it's a really amazing show. You should watch it. All right, goodbye.